and we hug people, And one of the first things that I was told when I came to the city, do not touch strange children. Do not touch people's children. Do not touch people until they touch you. So it was very, and we hug people at the beginning, and I think that's not necessarily true. But like for example, simple things like touching. For example, okay, you might meet an Islamic woman, and for example, they don't shake hands. Conservative women don't shake hands with men, right? And the American man is accustomed to shaking hands. Something as simple as that, for example. So you're quite right, Mona. It's difficult to understand what the differences are, what the similarities are, and how to go about
it. These are very interesting. Interesting / important issues. Anthony King, who wrote so much about colonial urban development. He tells me that he told me that when he first went to India, because he became interested and the whole thing stuck again after he went there. He went to teach something, then all of a sudden he started seeing this about colonial urban development, some things that he can understand because the Brits built it and he's British, which the Indians have very different meanings, which he cannot even understand. And his symbol for that is that, like when I first tried to shake hands, so it was in a way there was a greeting that never completed, because for the shake hand to complete, the other guy needs to shake hands. For a namaste to complete, the other guy should say this. At least we think in the West, that's how it's completed, reciprocated, and it never completed. For thinking, for scholarly work, this is all good, because then it raises a lot of questions. Then you start investigating. In a different way, this trip has to be very good in this sense. It doesn't seem like we're going to be comfortable. Unless we are superficially overly comfortable. Start swimming in my
even the small rituals are really, they can be really important and very confusing if you're not in that culture. I know when I started studying just the way you sit, the way you don't show the soles of your feet to somebody because that's a sign of disrespect. Sit down, stretch your legs out. Your feet are facing your teacher. That's a sign of huge disrespect, which for me didn't even register, until we're in a different culture in this thing. But even those small.
So how do we pass this barrier? If at that side, if I may take this discussion back to that side, if we have this stereotype, this is a big one, Orientalism, the American construction of the Middle East, and it may or may not be true to every place, again, we shouldn't homogenize and stereotype, further in any of these things, but we are going to a place, I'm sure we have stereotypes about these Michael has me, and some of you, I'm sure. Yeah. Sorry, you were trying to say something.
Oh, no. I think that one of the best ways of overcoming the personal stereotypes is to speak genuine experience. It's really easy to stay in a cluster of your people, you speak your language, you're comfortable. But if you don't hang out with people and talk to them and hear their stories and ask questions, remember, when I was in Southeast Asia, I had a lot of big aha moments where,
When you go where?
When I was in Southeast Asia.
Southeast Asia.
I'm embarrassed, but, I think that I was very much some of the people who taught it, Asian women, very subservient, and just the standard kind of stereotypical Western view of it. And I
actually made friends with a Thai woman and discovered that, wow, it's like these people were extremely valuing each other, were really powerful. I had no idea how wrong my stereotypes were. If I hadn't actually made friends with this person in the first time, I would never have known any different. So I think we all have to accept that no matter how open-minded we think we are, like we all carry stereotypes
Right.
about it as a culture.
And we might be creating some while we are there. I mean, one of the students, who went on Cafe One, a very smart student. We were fortunate to have some homes.
Okay, I will ask him.
And when she came back, she told her roommate here that how when she was laughing a little loud, how her sister, co-student, with whom she was working in a collaborative project, saying like, you're laughing too loud, women are not supposed to laugh too loud. Then she asked why, she said, it's our culture, and that's how it should be. I mean, it was interesting. I mean, this will happen continuously. Asking, what. Then when she came, and when she told her roommate here, she was appalled. Like she said, wow. Then it was, I mean, to her credit, she asked, why do you handshake? She said, isn't that the same? Like those guys don't laugh, too loud. I think the issue here is kind of like sometimes when we talk about the United States, I think I've read too many times that say the U.S. kind of like doesn't have a culture. I mean, in a derogatory way as well as in a positive way, because culture is kind of like old, archaic, unchanging. So we don't have one because we keep changing. The other one is kind of like derogatory, like those guys. So in either way, I think separates us because it's all of a sudden it makes it tremendously difficult for us to understand the culture. Because there is, probably very similar cultures. However it's built, So what do you expect to see? What do you expect to get?
I like what Francesca said about trying to find these, whatever this means, real experiences or genuine experiences. The more I've been traveling with you and in other places, the idea to try to get to know some, whatever we might say, regular people, local people, and to spend time with them and maybe spend time with them over time, maybe months, maybe years. Contact and keep visiting, have them come, has I think can get us closer to understanding the differences. I think it's one of points out in some of the similarities that we have. But other authors I've read might call that biography. To value the lives of others, as much as the stories that others have in their lives, or the narratives that they tell, or the rituals that they live within. Understandings that they have about the world, to find people that you can actually talk to long term and come to know, and to have their commentaries or their observations change you as well. I think it's really important. That notion of knowing someone, I think, is very powerful, actually.
Whenever we want people to risk of making generality. We're all saying, trying to recognize that thing is it's all based on the individual. I mean, as a 23-year-old grad student, you think about me as a 23-year-old grad student, but I'm going to be much different than any other grad student. So, I mean, just like with anything in life, I think it's about individual interaction with that person. So, it's not going to be exactly like anyone else.
Going off of that, we should be wary of assuming that you I mean, everyone's different and every situation's different. And especially at that time you're coming in, you don't know what's going on or what people are really like. Stop making judgments before we it's just friend that has the right thing trying to foretell what's going to happen or predict.
How about you, Johanna? What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that this experience is going to kind of like cause like an environmental consequences to function in the community. We're gonna have to check it. We don't know anything about that. Like, we don't know enough to really work through it as well as a member. We're gonna have to like, okay, this is how they do things. But also we're going to have to move past those generalizations and be remember that.
James?
I'm just kind of struck by, we talked about this, with the land over there and experiencing, but I guess it's, making me think about how do I live now and here and, generalize, football players. I mean, a certain planners, a certain stereotype of architects, and, I mean, I think we tend to overgeneralize, and so we can say that we're going to try and not have these stereotypes when we go over there, but I think it's important to not have stereotypes when we here. It can be the way that we live here, as an everyday occurrence, not just this 3 months.
But there's also like, there's also
Stereotyping and racist stereotyping, like, because sometimes you have to make generalizations just kind of frame for how we do and function in society. Like stereotypes should be gotten rid of. They can be negative and can be oppressive, but only if you act on them like to cause harm or to oppress people.
Add value to difference?
yeah.
Because there's difference.
Because there is
And then we have to
Right.
understand difference. Adding value as good or bad.
I agree on some level with that, but I just don't think that we can eliminate stereotypes because stereotypes exist. Because as you began this whole thing, saying like humans recognize patterns. That's how we process and that's how we navigate the world. And now I think by recognizing patterns, aggregating all these bits of information that we acquire. Stereotypes exist because to a certain extent they relate to patterns that we've observed. And whether or not they are true or universal, of course they're not, is almost irrelevant. I don't think we can eliminate that mechanism, this processes because this is so like I think we have to personally challenge that and say, okay, well, taking this into account, how is this actually different? That's a constant challenge.
So maybe the danger really is stereotypes as it is having an absolute nature to the stereotypes. Like recognizing that there is, it's not a black and white world. There is that gray area.
One of the things that, and this kind of generic example,
I think what I'm hearing here from here, I mean, we do use stereotypes to understand. And then the issue is about not having a stereotype, but we can use all these big words like totalizing and give value to that, saying good, bad, covering the head, is not a good thing, as well as covering the head is a good thing, rather than, that's a difference, and then you give value, and then a hierarchy. So hierarchy is good and bad. So in a different way, how we build ourselves, our own identity, the other. So we do that. But then on top of that, we are adding that. I think that's what is being kind of like questioned. Right?
So also seeing the stereotype instead of the individual.
All right. So that's in a sense called totalizing. And if you want to use it with the cultural studies term, totalizing means you take an abstract quality and you say everybody's like this. Totalized.
It's turned on its head though when you become the object. What happened to everybody?
Exactly.
I remember being in the Middle East when I had a tattoo that somebody saw, and they asked me, they're very forthright, they said, "Oh, so you've been in prison?" And I was like, "Oh, so you do a lot of drugs?" And I was like, "Where's this coming from? I don't understand." And I suddenly realized, like, wow, in this culture, like, having a tattoo actually is immediately equated.
How did they know that?
It was like in Germany, everybody assumes that Americans are trigger happy, like love guns, violence. Are not totally, but somewhat humanized compared to some other cultures. That we're just, like bored.
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's not right. What I was going to say when we were talking about stereotypes is, it's kind of a generic example, but it gets confusing with things like, let's just say work hard in China. Just because over here, I mean, a lot of times that's a stereotype. But you go there, and the thing is, they market that to you. They're like, oh, buy this company shirt, look at the martial arts we can do. I mean, it's everywhere, and you start to wonder, well, how much of this was actually true, and how much of it, now that you know it's popular to us, you're showing. Make it interesting. And that's how it becomes a little bit.
Americans are like the ones of the people that have latched on to the idea. The Irish are, well, my impression is the Irish don't think it's like really weird. We love it much, but they're going to tell us stuff when we want.
So, I mean, this is a grading clay. I mean, you wrote about the American landscape. You use this term called fixing. Like, you see a postcard of New York City, and you go and see the same place, you make a photograph of the same place, and bring back and show the people what I saw. So, in a different way, the stereotype, like this world of stereotypes constructed in this way, keeps continuing. You understand what I mean? I mean, India, somebody says I'm going to India, and India means Taj Mahal, I mean, that's the key, like, you go in front of Taj Mahal and make a picture, bring back, and show somebody, oh, no, I went to India, like, here's a picture in front of Taj Mahal, and you recognize the Taj Mahal, and you know that I've been there, done that, So, I mean, it's interesting what you were saying about Ireland, and you will see a lot of this, and Mike has seen this, because all our partner schools in China where we visited, they all had to kind of like show us some martial arts, otherwise we won't be happy.
I think most Indians that I know that I've met who are permanent residents in the United States, if they find out that I've been to India, they'll ask if I've seen the Taj Mahal. So it's sort of back to what you're talking about, I think, about how the local culture buys into the stereotype.
Yeah.
Even if it's local, as in not even in India anymore, but the Indians in the United States.
Yeah, even within countries, I mean, you can go back to Germany, that's why I know best, but it's like, you go, if you're from Berlin, and you come down to the Swedish forest or whatever, you expect to buy at a little trinket shop a little witch that you painted for. Because the kind of, vying for the board. So, but it happens. I think also internally, like intra-constructed culture as well as inter-constructed. Because when you think of when you're an American, you think Germany, you think later what's here. But you go to Germany and you think, you go to this area and you think of the fairy tales from the Brothers Grimm. That's where the Brothers Grimm are from. Like you think of Goethe, the Weimar Republic. I mean, they do it within the country too. I mean, you go to Texas and find cowboy movies,
Right. I mean, here in the States, like, I mean, my own experience is crossing boundaries. It's kind of like, it's an annoyance, in the way you go to any place, you ended up in the gift shop, I mean, it's like, it's all about spending money, you're supposed to spend money. And you can also see some of these ideas. Maybe it works here, maybe it doesn't work here, but in some other places when they try to internalize this quote-unquote Western models, and how it fails, because maybe they can't. That's not how it works, I mean, there are places where, tourists could go into, you have to buy tickets to go to Taj Mahal and so on. You go to some other places, the guy says, like, I'll charge you 5 rupees each or 10 rupees each, and the guy gets the money, and he doesn't sell any tickets, and you're going. I mean, and sometimes people might say corruption. I mean, one interesting thing about corruption that people have talked about, scholars have talked about is, one is getting a building permit, getting a building permit, and that's something that British colonials kind of like gave to all the colonized, and what happens is the guy goes to get a building permit, the health inspector who checks kind of like gives a hard time, then they give a little bit of money to the health inspector, and then bribe, if you will, and then he would okay it. And sometimes, like whether he would okay it or not, people would just go and settle without a certification at the end. So I mean, none of these things really work at the end. And from a Western standpoint, a lot of Western scholars say this is corruption. And is it really corruption, or is it there's a system that actually leads to corruption? Because if the system doesn't mean anything, the only thing is it's a bargaining tool. I have some power over you now because I can approve your plan. You give me some money, then I'll approve you. And so. Some of these are interesting.
Maybe I don't know if it connects exactly, but the notion of corruption.
Yeah.
Jackie, right? Jackie, you're studying with Talia? Yeah. So Talia gave me an article a couple months ago that we talked about autoethnography, and maybe instead of corruption, maybe a word there is resistance. In a way, to go back to something Ashley was saying, like getting the rich as you come out of the woods, and that's what you're supposed to get when you go to Germany. Maybe that's a kind of local resistance as well. Maybe there's a kind of energy there that where the locals are giving you what you want, and they're kind of happy to do that because that means you're not going to get close to them in a way that would be more genuine, or whatever that word genuine. So these sorts of notions of giving us what we want is also, I think, can be framed in the article on autoethnography as a kind of local resistance. You won't know me. You're not going to get to have me. I'm going to give you what you want, and that's the way to keep myself unknown or unknowable in that sense. Sorry, so sort of extending the stereotype actually by the locals or whoever causes us not to be able to get to really know one another.
I think that's a really good point. I'm kind of surprised by how we also latched onto the idea that stereotypes are a Western thing that we're imposing on other cultures. And I think that people kind of, everybody has stereotypes, and I'm sure that the people who will be meeting in Sri Lanka and India and wherever will have stereotypes of us as Westerners and as Americans. But I also think that these self-stereotypes, if you will, aren't just an extension of other people's stereotypes. Like there's the Irish, who are marketing leprechauns because that's what we want to buy. But what do the Irish stereotype themselves as? I'm sure they have their own, anybody who's traveled and met up with expatriates kind of had, knows there's something that we all seem to kind of connect over. It can be sports or, mutual longing for McDonald's or whatever it is. But there's something that, we kind of define ourselves as that may not even make sense to you as an individual, but you kind of buy into it as culture.
Hopefully on this trip, really having more experience like that, like shared experience, and in that sharing we can learn the genuine interests of the culture rather than kind of like fixes and the tourist centered activities where you just don't have through that boundary. You have a
I think this is exactly why we're having this discussion, and thank you. And this is probably exactly why you have signed up for this. Again, we all have our different interests, but I think that there's some. And we are going to do some projects. It's a project-based learning, at different level. And we are using the projector now. We can actually. The nice thing about that is not like we are working with people. Now, projects doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to tell us everything. As pointed out, when outsiders go to places, people know how to evaluate them. Are these guys from the broadline? Maybe we can ask them for some things, that we really don't even need, or we need, but and who are these guys? This is why I sometimes said, this is why I think you need to kind of like get to know these people. For example, once we were in Delhi, one faculty student, right, all disappointed, having 3 meetings with the faculty. It's tremendously difficult to do in India. So when we had an interesting talk, I said, why don't we just go to the village, because the thing is, it's much easier to. It's much easier to know what the municipality might say, because you can find that information. It's not so difficult. But unless you go and unless you create some sort of a connection with these people, you're not going to get to know them. So if you really want to, as we say, can we participate in people's processes? Can we even know the people? As Wes was saying, is there resistance? Will they give us something that we like? Some tea, and keep us aside. We don't know what happened in California. Maybe there's some of that, because they wanted to get this bill. But of course, you will get to know them because we went there. We wanted to build, but they didn't want to build on a particular day because that was not their auspicious day. So there is this really interaction. It's like getting to know somebody else here. How well could we know my friend? Yeah.
If I could, just to build on some of that automotive last comment, I think my sense of it is when we take students into South Asia and we partner up with local universities and local planning or architecture programs, whatever it might be, we'll be taking those students, we'll be taking the local students into parts of their world and their city that they've never been in as well. Right? And to get back to what Mona's saying, it really was powerful for me to start to understand in some way that in a way the middle class is kind of the middle class, right? Whether you're in Delhi or in Muncie or in Los Angeles or wherever you might be, it was really fascinating. As soon as I have, anyway, maybe that's enough. But you'll see that I remember on that trip, on the swimming trip, that you referred to the students swimming the mile. That was a real challenge for us because the local students were interested in taking our students to nightclubs, every night, because this was what they were doing in their life, and this is what they thought our students wanted to do, and most of our students wanted to do it. And so that was extremely challenging for us, I think, and it was maybe the first time I started thinking, and even now we have a lot of international students in the post-professional master's program of architecture. And many of those students from South Asia and other parts of the world, they come to Muncie and study with us, and they talk to their first poor people. their first squatters, maybe. So in their home countries, they know where not to go in the same way we know where not to go in our own countries. There are some really interesting commonalities across these.
Like little part of overlapping groups, as if it's middle class
Yes,
that
yes.
work, that doesn't necessarily correlate with nationality or ethnicity.
Yes, yes. Could be, I mean, I'm almost sure that when we go into Mumbai, and Neil's working hard to set up this part of the but the Indian students that we work with locally, it's going to be their first time probably in an informal settlement as well. It's like it might be your first time. So so sometimes we give the locals like too much credit for giving us some sort of new perspective or for a kind of knowledge that they have on the ground. And a lot of times, sometimes they might not.
I think, I mean, in addition to the questioning, I mean, of course, I'm sure we all been questioning in our work, the validity of these stereotypes. I mean, are there Indians, So how many kinds of Indians? Are there Americans? How many kinds of Americans are there? Because there are Indians who are living in this, informal settlement, as well as there are Indians who have never seen an informal settlement, and there are Indians who are working in shipbreaking yards without any shoes or whatever. There are Indians who doesn't even know the fact that there are ships broken in their backyard. So it's interesting. I mean, most of these students that we will be meeting, they are bright. Some of them have middle class. I mean, they are from middle class families. They are probably afraid to see go into informal settlements because they think they'll eat them or something. Yeah. Well, we will be continuing this. So this is I've talked quite a bit about Dr. Melinda Messineo. Here she is.
You didn't just make it up. You probably lied, but I actually did. So, great.
What's your name, Mark?
How are you?
Yeah. So I'll let her continue. I've told them about the research. The fact that you're a good teacher, you will eat right with them so well.
I hope so. So first of all, I want to say hello. Again, my name is Melinda Messineo. I teach in the Department of Sociology. I see some familiar faces, and that's always exciting. I must say, I am so jealous of this opportunity that you're going to have with Cafe Asia. I'm just so impressed by what you guys do every year or every time the program goes out, and I just think it's an amazing experience. And so just kudos to you and congratulations to you for being selected and taking the initiative to participate in this program. As a sociologist, I am especially sensitive to this idea about intercultural communication and the different cultural groups coming together and the impact that stereotypes have on our ability to interact and frame and be reflective on the experiences that we're having. So today, I have a few minutes I want to share with you just some ideas about stereotypes and then how we as participants in a to our own stereotypes and how we can respond to those accordingly. And so I'd like to have you, whatever you're writing on or something that you're writing on, to draw a line, and below this line, I would like you to do a quick reflection exercise. And what I'd like you to do is to write down everything that you know that is not mediated by some other entity or being or person. And so I studied media. I look at the portrayal of race, class, and gender in the media, and we'll talk a little bit more about stereotypes in the media. But I want to start out with this exercise where you're thinking about, okay, what do I know that wasn't in some way mediated by something? So what do you know that wasn't mediated by a book or a television or a film or somebody else telling you it? What do you know? So do a quick brainstorm. I know blah, blah. So just write down, what are some things that you know that was not mediated? I'm being very careful how I say that so I don't.
It's a webcam. Media side, yeah.
Media. Get this to go. Great. We'll come back to that eventually. Okay, so I'm curious to see what you were smiling, amused by their own knowledge. What do you have? What do you know that hasn't been mediated by something? Some way? Short list. What do you have? What do you have on your list? Just a few items.
I don't have one thing really because all I really know is the experience.
Okay, so you know physical sensation. What are some of these physical sensations that you know?
The warmth of the sun, what things feels like, what colors look like.
Okay, so you know this sort of really this experience, this little experience that you have had. What are some other things that you know? Okay, all right. If I jump up, I come back down. And if it's off the house, right, I come down very quickly and very hard. So what else do we know? What did you write down?
Off of that, yeah, the sensory perception, anything that I've kind of learned through trial and error.
Okay.
So things like how high I can pile things before they're toppled.
Okay. Sort of the Jenga experience, right? You know,
Exactly.
Okay, what else do you know? What do you have on your list?
I have death is inevitable.
Okay.
You
Have you experienced anything dying, like a pet or something?
Okay.
Okay, so you do have experience. So while it isn't your own mortality that you have.
I could have seen it. Oh, well, that'll happen to them.
Not necessarily. Still
On TV and everything else.
Anything else? Things that you know.
Something else that occurred to me was spiritual experiences.
Okay.
Anything that, your own, it's not necessarily sensory, but your own kind of feeling of enlightenment or just, again, feelings.
Very good. So that feeling, I mean, even
Right.
this idea of faith, right?
Yeah,
You know,
that-
that is very personal. Like,
Right.
I mean, you can hear about other things, but to feel it or to know it
I
is
do
very
not
personal.
know that the Scripture in the Holy Book is true from my own experience, but I do have those moments of feeling something greater than myself or whatever. And that, I think, is not
Okay. Good.
Just direct and personal experiences, I think, is what sums it all up. That's all from what you're saying, that's all you can really know. At the core of it is what you can directly observe or experience.
Right, so we are limited, right? Our knowledge is limited. It is constrained by what we can experience. And so much of our other knowledge and understanding is mediated. Right? So the example is, wow, pretty much everything I know, I'm taking as faith or taking for granted that my source is a reliable source, that what I am experiencing is authentic, that it is real, that it is a legitimate experience. Now, sometimes our own filters are preventing us from even having an authentic experience, right? I think this about it, I have this understanding of the situation. But we hope that, at the very least, that the sun is warm and that I'm interpreting, that correctly, and that these things that I have seen. And so what that sensitizes us to is the fact that our knowledge of pretty much everything is very mediated beyond what we experience ourselves. And so we have to be very aware of our sources and the context in which we receive this information. So I'll open this to you. What is it that you know about Asia and this region that you will be going to? Have any of you been there before? Do you have real experiences in this region, you can say, okay, yes, I know that the weather feels like this here, and I know what this feels like. I know my experience with these people. But for many of us with no experience, it will be mediated very much through what other people tell us, and also what the media has shown us about these areas. I often ask people about their sense of the war in Iraq right now. People have feelings about the war in Iraq. They know about the war. They understand the war, right? And they'll ask, well, how many of you have been there? I mean, very rarely have people been there. How many of you know someone who has been there? A number of people will know someone who has been there. And then I say, well, then how do you know anything about Iraq? And they usually say, well, because of the media. I know from the media. And if you can trust your sources, then that's as good as anything, right? If you can't trust your sources, then you just have to, at the very least, be aware that you are dealing with only part of the picture. I'm very curious, and I suspect that this group will not represent my social 100 class, but how many of you read an international paper or look at international source websites? Oh, so this is definitely not my social 100 class. Most people are like, I read the daily news, I see the local paper, that's what I know about the world. So obviously that's going to be a much less broad experience. So if you're looking at international news sources, you're probably going to have a broader experience. But most of our daily interactions with the media are typically within the area of popular culture. And so I want to talk a little bit about the stereotypes that exist about Asia and different parts of Asia in our popular culture. So I just want to show you some imagery that I think is fairly representative of the stereotypes that we have in our culture. So this is a very specific area in Asia, right? This is hard, right, to find images of Asia in the sort of popular culture. What does this represent in terms of Asia? What do you see? What are the sort of stereotypes that you see? Okay, feudal, yeah, this idea. What else is this? This is very Far East Asia, right? I mean, we are defining Asia in a much broader context than the media usually portrays. What else do you see? Okay. Okay, the geisha. Okay, so images about gender and gender identity as interpreted through the media, Asian gender roles, very stereotypical in many ways. I often ask my students in my sociology of media class, name the last movie where you saw two Asians kiss. Eventually people come up with something, but it's hard, right? I mean, the Asians are not considered leading characters, and when they are, they're usually not paired up with, it's usually an Asian female, and you rarely see Asian males, whether Far Eastern Asian or Asian in the broader sense. And so one thing that I see in my own research is that we have a real lack of imagery of Asia, and the images that we have are very stereotypical, and often they are very much of Far Eastern Asia, this very narrow interpretation of what that means. Now, within the popular culture, we have one character that you may be familiar with as probably the most stereotypical that we'll see in part like Mumbai and the region that you'll be going to. What do you know about Apu? How many of you have seen Apu on television before? So we're familiar with it. Tell me about him. People are all nervous. What are the stereotypes that he represents? Okay, thank you. Okay, right. Yes, what else? Yeah.
Place of work.
Say that again?
The place of work.
Yeah, so there's the Quickie Mart. What are other sort of stereotypical understandings that we have about? Yeah. Okay, humongous family. What else?
Work kind of is his life, like that's kind of, he's defined by that particular portion of what he does, and the rest of his life either doesn't exist or is irrelevant.
Right. I mean, there's many episodes where he's like dying, but he still goes to work, or doesn't he leave the Quickie Mart once, and then he just doesn't know what to do with himself because he's been so completely defined by the Quickie Mart, right? So we can think of all these different ways that these stereotypes are represented in him as a character. Yeah.
And then also compared to other characters who know
Okay. So he's behind the times, right? What are his positive characteristics?
really friendly, but almost like they almost portray him in a way of naivete, like doesn't know the American way.
Okay, so very friendly but naive. Okay, and there's something endearing about his naivete, but it's also problematic. You know, he doesn't know, he doesn't understand. Other characteristics about him. Any negative characteristics? Say that again. Oh, he's cheap? And what was the second one? Okay, as a negative type of thing. Okay, so yes, this idea that he's cheap, right? I think there's this one where he's trying to sell meat that is very, very old, and because he's trying to save money, and he's trying to sell this idea. And then, how prestigious is it to own, a Quickie Mart? So yeah.
Melinda, there are also participants whom you can't see.
Okay.
So that's, you figured it out.
The computer's telling me. So wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad you're also participating. So very smart. Okay, so we have these stereotypes, and they are brought to us courtesy of the Middle East. But if we didn't have Apu, there would be very little representation, right, of Indians in our popular culture representation. Definitely in the news, but not so much in our everyday representation. And so there are negative and positive stereotypes that are represented by him in the media. And it brings up this point, this idea of positive and negative stereotypes within our culture. One of the challenges is that the way that the brain processes information in some way encourages stereotyping. How the brain works is that we have constructs, and when we receive new information, we try and place that within existing constructs. And only at the point where we are faced where there is no existing framework to place it in, do we create or modify or add to the existing constructs that we have in our head. So when we are faced with something new, the first thing we're going to do is compare it to experiences that we've already had. Try and place it with that. How does it compare? We do it very quickly, right? When you come to a situation, you're in a new subway station, you go, okay, well, all the subway stations that I've been in before, I know that there's a place where I'm supposed to get tickets. And so you go and find the thing that most closely represents that. We do that all the time. Like when we look at people, we say, okay, in all my other experiences with someone like this, I have behaved this certain way. Well, that is less problematic when you've had lots of experiences, lots of different constructs to set these experiences into. However, if you've had no experience, little experiences, or the only ones are these very mediated experiences through very stereotypical representations, your ability to be very accurate measures of that situation are going to be limited. Now, hopefully, you're all open-minded and you recognize it's going in, but it's very challenging because if you have nothing to base it on, right? There's nothing to place that new information into. You've got to figure out how to deal with it. I wanted to provide some other sort of images that sort of fit into these stereotypes that we have about Asia. Now this one's, it's sort of poking fun, right? It's sort of playing. What do you see when you see this? Again, this is Far East, but what does this tell us about this different cultural group?
I was going to say that she said earlier that, these women are shy or
timidity, this shyness. However, there's this interesting other side to Asian representations, and non-Americans also. You don't see cigarette ads anymore, but I'll give you this example. It's not too old. I don't know if you can see on her neck she has a tattoo with characters. And the text says, when we ask for your honest opinion, you should know that this is a trick question. What is the other aspect of Asian women, foreign women, besides the sort of timid side? Well, there's another side about gender role stereotypes that we have about women from this region.
Also asks if
Okay. Yeah, a sex symbol, sex object, something played upon, right?
And also, I think, maybe secretive and manipulative.
Okay, this idea.
Instead of getting what they want in a straightforward way, they would go about it through seduction or through some sort of underhanded way.
Yeah, so there's this sort of sinister aspect to it, this underhanded, this, okay, I'm not going to be straightforward with you, but I'm going to be manipulative. Very good. There's also this idea of the exotic and the exotified, and I think you saw a film on Orientalism and this idea. This plays in basically any culture, right, that's different than considered, the sort of mainstream America, that which is not understood is considered exotic and it's exotified. And that's problematic, right? I mean, these are stereotypes and they fit into our constructs, and you need to be aware of them and then understand how do you fit new pieces into them. So those are the images I'm going to show. So I'm going to go sit back down. Over. And so these are not new to you, obviously, but I want to sensitize you to this idea that what we know is constrained by what we know. Like, we have so little experience that we are forced to base it on either media exposure that we've had or other sort of contexts that you've had, and often those are very limited and stereotyped in their degree of representation. And so when we think about dealing with stereotypes within sociology, there are basically 4 different theories that are put forward about what encourages prejudice and stereotype among different cultural groups, and then ways to break down stereotypes and prejudice. So I'll talk about those 4 different theories. The first theory is known as scapegoat theory. Scapegoat theory. Does anyone know what a scapegoat is, or where that idea came from? What's a scapegoat? It's a really big goat. Scapegoat. What's a scapegoat? Yeah.
Basically, someone like some way to get the guilt.
Very good. Yeah, so to get your guilt or fault or blame off of you and put it on someone else. Does anyone know the origin of the, why goat? My understanding is that it's an Old Testament reference, and that actually communities would do this. They would put their sins upon the goat and then slaughter the goat in atonement for their sins, or send the goat away to take away literally their sins and their blame and guilt and things like that. And so you can see, within that tradition, how, sacrificing animals to atone for sin, and then ultimately atonement in that model. So you can see how, where that terminology comes from, this idea of the scapegoat. Well, within sociological research, we look at how it is that groups of similar power within a social system will often perpetuate prejudice based on this idea of scapegoating. That they are experiencing problems, and so they blame someone of similar power, typically, for the troubles that they are facing. For example, right now in the United States, you'll see a lot of people who are blaming, Hispanics for, was that the group you were thinking of? The Hispanics for, taking our jobs and ruining our jobs and this type of thing. So you'll have people working on the line in a factory, and there'll be this one person who is blaming this other person for their poor working conditions and their low pay. Well, what's interesting is that the person in this position is rarely in the position of power, never in the position of power to really have done anything about it other than they're there and they're also working on the line. The focus should probably be higher up in the organization, the institution, organization, because these are the persons who are setting the wages, these are the persons who are setting the hours, these are the persons who are identifying the work environment, but they're looking down the line and they're going, you're the reason why I'm suffering here, and they're both sitting there looking at each other like, I'm suffering because of you, I'm suffering because of you, right? So this idea of the scapegoat theory, that I'm putting my blame on someone. So these are people of similar power. And so, of course, within sociology and Marxian theory, the idea is if these similarly oppressed groups could unite and join together, then they could understand that they have a very shared experience and they could work against the oppressor. You see this intercultural groups interaction as well. When these groups that are of similar positions come together, they blame one another for their experience of oppression, not recognizing that the blame could be targeted higher. The second theory about prejudice and stereotypes and how it gets maintained within a culture is called authoritarian personality theory. This one actually comes into the social sciences through psychology, the authoritarian personality theory. And as suggested by the title, it implies that there is a personality type that is significantly more likely to be prejudiced in their interactions with other cultures. And the personality type is the authoritarian personality. And so to identify if someone has that type of personality, there's no different questionnaire that a person can go through. But basically, the authoritarian personality type tends to see things as this or that, either or. It's either this, there's no gray area, there's no in-between, there's no moderation. They tend to see things as dichotomous, that there's this option or this option. And you can see that someone who comes to different cultures and different interactions and thinks it's either this or this, like there's no in-between ground, is probably going to be very prejudiced in their interactions. It's very difficult for them to see, well, yeah, but maybe this, how do I moderate that? And so the second theory about prejudice and stereotyping is that of the authoritarian personality. The third is control theory. Control theory. And control theory says that people in positions of power use stereotypes to justify maintaining people in lower positions of power. So control theory says that people in positions of power use stereotypes and prejudices to justify maintaining people in lower positions of power. Now, sometimes people can confuse scapegoat theory with control theory. But the thing to remember is in scapegoat theory, those are people of similar power levels, prejudice and discriminating against one another. Control theory is people of higher levels compared to people of lower levels, and they're using stereotypes and prejudices to maintain this power differential. Can someone come up with an example of something that would be like an example of stereotypes and prejudice within control theory?
I'm currently teaching a class on the history of South Africa, and we're talking about apartheid story. And it's this idea that whites are a superior race, and that the reasons that there weren't any blacks in power was because they were lazy, hard enough, all of this kind of thing. And then that became internalized within the black community.
Right, and so it becomes a sort of justification. Well, we would like them, but they're just not smart enough. Right. Or, this is a very sort of paternalistic kind of model that we're doing it for the better of everyone because they're just not up to this task.
And as you hear that repeated over and over again, it keeps their
this internalization of this stuff. Very good. I mean, that's the whole process right there.
It's also, Melinda, the traditional South Indian people as plantation workers in Sri Lanka work in their plantation. They were given like 10 by 10. I mean, this is how the built environment, determines like what they do. They were given 10 by 10 rooms called lines. That's the term that they use. They were given lines. So they just had this 10 by 10 room. And of course, they have to do a lot of other things. They have to cook, they have to do the toilet, they have to bathe. Many decades later, one congressman, somebody in the legislature, colonial legislature, brought this up saying, like, these guys are defecating everywhere. Like, we need to give them toilets. That's how they do it. Because maybe we should let them do what they do. Because they've created this situation, and now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example too. Responding to the situation. Yeah. Very good. The fourth one is known as cultural theory. Cultural theory. So the fourth theory that looks at prejudice and stereotypes is cultural theory. And this is an interesting one. It says that prejudice and stereotyping is endemic. It is part of culture. That, and specifically, cultures support and increase the likelihood of prejudice and stereotypes just by the nature of how they are set up. So I'll give you an example. One of the ideologies in American culture, at the very least since post-World War II, but probably prior to that, is the sense that we really are number one in the world, right? This idea that, we won the Second World War, we freed, all this, this idea about the prominence of the United States. And that has become very much part of our cultural identity. Now, if we look statistically, you would see that we are, ranked 26th here, or 27th, or 50th here in different measures. That doesn't seem to really impact our sort of sense of ourselves, because our culture is very much around this idea of our being number one, and we are the top. And so, when you have a cultural identity that defines itself as number one, what is the outcome of that being part of your cultural identity? Yes, exactly. Yeah, yes. It's this huge hegemonic sort of process. Right. And this is what it looks like. And as you as an individual, when you approach everyday interaction, what does that mean? Like, how does that impact your interactions with other people? If you have this cultural idea. Now, any individual may have a different perspective, but what does that do? Right? Yeah.
I think about something we're number one, we can do whatever we want.
Okay.
People should be like more like should take on the different ideas.
Right, exactly. So this idea, well, we're the best, so our ideas must be the best, so everything else must be at least less best, not as good. And if they knew what they were doing, they would adopt what we were doing anyway, right? So this idea of ethnocentrism, and we've heard this term, this idea of we are very ethnocentric, this idea that even though we are very diverse culturally, we have this shared ideology about our supremacy. And by having this idea of our being number one, we're number one, then it by default puts other culture at a lower level or inferior level through our ethnocentric practice. And to the point that if you don't buy into this, what happens if you even question, you sort of alluded to this, if you even question the supremacy of the United States, what is that considered? Unpatriotic, right? I forget, we were in a session earlier and it was talking about where the U.S. falls in terms of maternal leave, and we're like at the bottom of this list, wherever it is, and people were, just it never comes up in conversation, right? That we would be anything but extremely high, within the top 5, right? No, we're very low in mortality rates, all kinds of things that you'd probably be surprised to hear. So what cultural theory says is that when you have cultural ideology that builds up a cultural model to be supreme and high and number one, it by default defines other cultural approaches as inferior. Now, it doesn't have to, but in the current model, this ideological model of being number one, being the top, not being as good as, but being better than, sets this up so we have stereotypes and prejudices that seem justified. Now, this can happen in other cultures also, right? Any culture that feels that it is better and supreme compared to all other cultures is going to, by default, view difference and otherness as less good, inferior, if not equal, definitely not as good.
That can be something that's really difficult to understand for somebody from a culture that doesn't necessarily view themselves felt that way. I mean, half of my family is from Belgium, and they have the inferiority complex. But when we're talking about like American politics and just, you know, the fact of living here, they really don't understand how we can't see those things about ourselves that we're, you know, like 50th in maternity leave, and that we elected, you know, somebody who probably wasn't the most popular choice, at least in first, you know, around, and they just don't understand how we can be so convinced that we're absolutely right in everything when there's so much evidence that we're not, because that's not the way that they structure their worldview.
And that's such a great example, and someone who's on the outside looking in has a much better perspective of this, right? Now think about it, you know, why does this happen? Like, how is this possible that we could be so unaware of these other, you know, rankings? I refer you to question 1 of, you know, of our presentation here, right? This idea, well, what do you know? And if you aren't deliberately going out there pursuing international views and other views, and those are skewed too, right? I mean, those are coming from different filters, and they have different perspectives too. But at the very least, it is a different view, and you can see, okay, what are the possible interpretations of any given event, and then you can pursue evidence, you can look at the facts, and you'll come to a conclusion as well. And again, you know, that will be framed by your own experiences and your understanding of the environment. But this is challenging, right? And we will never be perfect. And I think that's depressing in some way. Like, is there truth out there? Is there truth to be known? And depending on which theoretical perspective you come from, some people believe, yes, there is a truth out there separate from our understanding that can be known. And then you can have another perspective that, no, it is all relative and socially constructed, but if you understand the context and the players and the agents that are part of the construction of their reality, then you can have at least better understanding and also understand your own biases that you bring to your understanding. So somewhere in there, you may find your own perspective is more closely aligned. So when we talk about stereotypes and prejudice, there are, you know, how do we respond to this? You know, well, partly just being sensitive to the fact that it biases our understanding of world events and our own positioning in the world. So that's just part of it, you know, understanding that there's a potential bias. Knowing that the story that we have is only part of the picture will also help it. The other thing that we support within sociology is this idea of practicing cultural relativism. So this idea of cultural relativism, as opposed to being ethnocentric in our approach with different cultures, is to practice cultural relativism. The idea behind cultural relativism is that you do not judge that other culture by the standards of your own culture. You judge that culture based on the standards of that culture itself. Now, this is problematic. I mean, we can problematize this issue a bit, but let's talk about it in this initial sort of interpretation. Cultural relativism is this idea that you don't use your standards of your culture to judge something that you see, but you use the standards of the culture from which it comes. I'll give you a classic example. If you're in my Social 100 class, you've heard this example before. I went to Italy. I was on this trip with a number of different people. We're on this sort of tour, this group tour. And I remember that there were 2 people on the trip who were very frustrated that the Italian shops would close, you know, 1 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We were different places. It was different times depending on the community. And they were just furious because that's when we would have free time from our tours during the day, and they'd want to go shopping, and they would get there, and all the stores in these communities would be closed. And you can guess, you know, how did they interpret it? So it's those idiots. Yeah. What are they? You know, those stupid Italians. They shut their stores. What are they? They must be. They're lazy, right? They're going home. They're sleeping, I hear, right? You know, they're going home. They're having lunch with their families. I eat my lunch at my computer every day, right? Okay, what do we think? And so they're furious. They're upset. They couldn't go shopping, and they're convinced that the Italians are lazy. Okay? That was a very ethnocentric interpretation. Is it inaccurate? I mean, the store was shut. They were not there. They were eating with their family, and they may have taken a nap, right? You know, I mean, the facts of the situation we cannot, dispel, but the interpretation and the framing of it, right? How else might we have interpreted that from a culturally relativistic interpretation of that? Yeah.
Maybe they don't value work.
Yeah, maybe they don't value money as highly as we do. Like, what might, yeah. Yeah, they have a different value of money. They have a different pace, a different approach to their daily activity. Yeah.
Well, maybe for them, having that time with their family is more important than, what in our society we might want to make a lot of money so we can buy our family stuff, but not ever see them. And over there, they might think that, having that lunch with their family and that nap or whatever is more important than anything that money can buy.
Okay, right. So they've made a decision, and yes, you could work more and then be able to buy things for your family. Or you could maybe not buy as many things for them, but you would have more time with your family. Now, you can reverse it too, right? We could be ethnocentric as Italians and interpret American behavior similarly negatively. Like, what can we say about those stupid Americans? Okay, what can we say? They're so impatient, they're so aggressive. What else? Yeah, the money. I mean, just, what do they think about this money? They're just so, what else?
They never take time to enjoy things.
They never take time to enjoy things. The facts probably not in our, we do work a lot. We don't spend as much time with our family. We spend a lot of money on things, this type of thing. Right, the facts, but also the interpretation of that. Now, what can we learn from that? Well, both cultures can learn from that, right? The Italians can learn what from our interpretation of their behavior? As ethnocentric as it is, what might they take away from that? That might be
without it, really appreciate their work.
They could probably make more money if they were open more hours, right? And that may be to their benefit, and it may improve their economy, right? I mean, that's a good point. Thank you. What could we as Americans learn from their interpretation of our work ethic?
Sometimes you're more productive if you kind of step back and look at things instead of going and trying to get there as fast as possible, maybe.
Yeah, very good.
It's much higher. Stuck into their work and get caught up in their career and things like that.
Maybe the reason why you don't feel connected to your family is because you're not spending as much time as you might with them. Obviously the lesson, we can see what we can take away. I mean, we want to practice cultural relativism. We want to, appreciate that culture for what it's trying to accomplish, right? And we can learn about our own culture by those sort of awkward moments that we feel when there's this sort of disconnect, or it's different, it's not what we're familiar with. And, cultures can learn from one another, and that's why understanding what we value is so critical. Because with that bit of information, yes, I could make more money if I were open in the afternoon. Let me think about what is it that I value. And what we value, sometimes we don't articulate that very well. But understanding what a culture values can understand their motivations for the choices that they're making. And maybe we might want to influence the values of another culture or be more reflective about our own values as a culture, what we can learn from that. This idea of cultural relativism. Now, I want to complicate this just a little bit by saying, are there situations where our own practice of cultural relativism is problematic in the sense that are there situations where being culturally relativistic is inappropriate? And I'll give you an example. Do you have an example?
No.
Go ahead, I want to hear yours.
All right. Well, and I mean,
that was exactly the example. You're so smart. So the idea, yes, female genitalia mutilation, right? Female circumcision, this idea that it's a cultural tradition that women genitalia to be treated in this way, And so we as a society could say, well, that's mutilation, that's horrible, she's being tortured, that's wrong. Or we can be cultural relativistic and say, in respect of your traditions, I say that, okay, well, we would not do that in my culture. I recognize that this is part of your culture, and so I back off. Now, is that problematic? Yeah. I mean,
a lot of boys are circumcised.
It removes the clitoris or the clitoris, depending on.
How did we know that
True. I mean, you could make. I mean, I think your statement is more. I think your statement is more of a statement. Our culturally acceptable circumcision is not that different from, this unculturally. So in some ways, we're being inconsistent, right? Saying that this is okay because we accept it. This one's not okay because we don't accept it. I think that what that brings us to is that question about values. Like, are there values that transcend cultural norms? Like the right to, the protection of the body. Are there rights that transcend cultural norms? And you can imagine, choice, freedom of choice. And you mentioned that little boys don't have a choice either. Okay, there's something about that choice that if the woman was given a choice, then okay, I guess I'll have to accept her decision. I'd like to know the socialization that led to her making that choice, but ultimately, who am I to take that choice from her? The little boy in our country, they don't have a choice. Maybe we should wait. Maybe we should let boys get to a point where they can choose. And everyone's like, no, we don't do it that way. Right, we don't do it that way. And that's why we have to look at the things that we take for granted within our culture, that when we confront it in other situations, that we need to be sensitized to possible implications of our own cultural views. What's hard is we don't even know what they are. Like you were saying, I can't believe you Americans don't see this. No, we don't see it. And it's probably because we're isolated in our little world, the stereotypes that we have, and we don't challenge ourselves very often. And when we are challenged, it's within this framework. What is this phrase that we hear from our current administration? There's a phrase that is put out there for why people are upset with America. There's many. What's that?
They envy our freedom.
They envy our freedom. They envy our freedom, or they hate our freedom. I mean, this is like these sort of statements out there, and that's just an erroneous framing, right? That just doesn't really make sense when you think about, okay, what is the cultural context that we're being perceived in? What are our values being perceived as? Within these cultural contexts. So we need to be aware of just our lack of constructs when we approach another culture. Unless you've had experience, you're going to lack places to put these in other than these sort of stereotypical things that we've had exposure to. So there's not much you can do other than to increase those experiences, increase your awareness, and just be sensitive to the fact I have no experience in these informal settlements, right? I have nothing to put this into. And so I have a few holes maybe that I'm going to put it into, but I need to be willing to create new constructs to place. People that you're coming in contact with will have similar experiences as you and they're completely different. And sometimes that can be more disconcerting. Sometimes it's easier to meet with people completely different than ones who have similar up to a point within a completely different interpretation. Like the middle class, our interpretation of what it means to be middle class has parallels and then completely diverges in some ways. And so you want to be sensitive to how those things might diverge when you're interacting with these different. And then to be aware of the different theories that surround prejudices. And these are useful when you hear not only your own prejudices and stereotypes coming out. Sensitive as we are, we bring prejudices into situations. Sometimes they're even positive prejudices. One prejudice that we have about East Asian and Asia just in general is how hardworking and how smart they are and how good in math and computer science they all are, right? All of them, every last one of them is good in all these. What is problematic about positive stereotypes? Why is it a problem, right? Yeah. apply to everyone, right? You know, and it really does limit your interpretation. But every time you see an Asian, your assumption is they're good at math and computer science, and then you ask them to fix your laptop, right? And they're like, what? Because yeah.
Another thing is we don't always think. I mean, we say like, oh, they're really smart. We don't think about that. They go to school way more than we do. I mean, they're schooling them Sunday, all day. They live in school, and not a lot of them really like that. Like, you know what I mean? So we start thinking, oh, it's great that you're all smart. That must be awesome. And they're thinking, we have to go to school all the time, and this isn't. We'd rather be doing something else. Because I mean, there's black people, what's the answer? The test that's really important to them. The suicide rate goes up. I mean, these are things that go into it. It's not just, oh, you're intelligent. You be educated.
Right,
and
so what are the negative aspects of that experience? Are we sensitive to that at all? You know, how did someone get to that? Yeah.
It's also interesting that the mothers, sometimes it has nothing to do with the kids. Like sometimes mothers can get into fights because of the competition that the kids should be having in the classroom.
Yeah. So good. So
and also people don't like it. I mean, as you're saying, I know. I mean, I grew up in Sri Lanka. Like I'm Sri Lankan, and people see they're Indian. And one of the things some of those people do, not to be Indian, is not to do computer science.
Yeah. So fighting against her. So in summary, this idea of our experiences being framed and constrained by the experiences that we have, and so recognizing the role that media has in the construction of these stereotypes, knowing how mental processes predispose us to seeking out things that are stereotypes, because how do we place them into our mental construct? Understanding these theories about prejudice and stereotyping and recognizing them in our own interactions, positive and negative stereotypes and prejudices, as well as recognizing them in the discussion of other people that you'll be interacting with. I appreciate what you were saying earlier about a lot of the natives that you'll be interacting with will have prejudices and stereotypes about the populations that you'll be working with also. And so fantastic resources for information, but also you'll want to be looking at their interpretations of the event as part of this picture also, and I think and as your own interpretations as part of this picture also. And so the real importance is being very reflective, self-aware, understanding when you enter a situation how your responses may be a reflection of ideology from your own culture, reactions to discomfort. A lot of times we resort to stereotypes and prejudices because of situations that are unfamiliar to us, and that's part of just our mental processes, and also just getting out of our comfort zone can be very disconcerting in many ways. And then being sensitive to cultural, being able to practice cultural relativism, but recognize that cultural relativism does not mean turning a blind eye to injustices. I mean, there are things that are beyond just cultural norms that we need to be aware of. And you may
Yeah, can I ask you a question? Or
Yeah.
do you run?
I have a couple minutes, yeah.
Okay. Like, I mean, one of the things that we've seen is like, Dubai, there's a huge shipwrecking. I don't know whether we can see that. Hopefully, we'll try to see our students, like first they see, of course, with our own stereotype, this environment is polluted, and there are no women in the shipwrecking. Industry itself, but so they didn't see that one. And they were talking about this appalling working conditions because they don't wear and then boots and everything like that and so on. And we understand that. But the thing is, would it be injustice? I mean, the issue of justice, because the thing is, like the same thing existed in Manchester and New York and all the places during the Industrial Revolution and so on. I don't want to put this in a kind of like a time frame, like latecomers and newcomers, whatever, but that existed. But the people themselves have to solve this in some ways. Like we can't do it. Like we can't say, from tomorrow you do this or something like that. We can leave and things can come back to status quo. So how do we deal with this injustice There's nothing we can, there's no role for us.
I mean, that's a great comment too, in this idea that the previous state was preferable and less oppressive. You know, this idea. You know, so I think that we as individuals, I mean, probably being aware of what our role, or at least our country's role, in some of this dismantling. They've got the ship dismantling. They also have the computer dismantling stuff, and it's the same thing where they're stripping wires and stuff. They're completely exposed to all of these toxic things. We can be more responsible in how we dispose of things and make choices in our everyday. What's that?
Produce.
Yes.
How these things are produced here.
Yes, how they are produced, how they're disposed of, and so those people are working and making money, and the emphasis should not be on them as individuals and these poor choices that they're making, right? This is the economy that they exist in. We, as individuals, have choices in how many of these items are produced, how they are disposed of, and again, those ships, people who get the scrap are making so much profit over the labor of these individuals. We need to support labor efforts in those countries because you're right, they're going to be working, they're going to be in those places, and one person there standing. I mean, you can't just tell them, leave this job, you know, I mean, that's just unrealistic.
Or if they need to change, I mean, they need to, Western experience was unionization, whatever, I mean, how you establish your rights. And if they need to, I mean, they need to do it.
Right, and we can't impose it. And if anything, if we've learned a big lesson on trying to impose things on cultures, yes, I think, but supporting grassroots efforts in those areas, I think, would be a great response. Are trying to impose it on a group. No, because, and they're going to come to it the way within their culture. But turning your back on it is not, let them handle it isn't exactly the right response. That wasn't what you were saying at all. But it has to be endemic to that cultural environment. And sometimes we can't even perceive the complexities of that, not because we're stupid, it's more like we're naive, that we don't understand the complexities.
I think what you said was great. I mean, I think that relates to what we were talking about. It's, in a different way, we can impose, but also at the same time, we can actually see the injustices, work with the grassroots organizations and so on. So it's all about this huge complexity. At one level, you know, there was a statement there. At one level, we really don't know what to do.
Well, I just thought something that was interesting about practicing cultural relativism. How do we judge a culture by its own standards without inheriting its own prejudices? You know, sometimes we can maybe bring, not being from that culture, we can bring maybe a more objective view in certain circumstances. In maybe like in the ship-breaking circumstances, we don't, you know, have this perception that, oh, that's just the way things are, you know, whatever, those people deserve it, or, you know, whatever the stereotype may be in that situation. We can bring maybe a different perspective.
Right, we're like the Italian versus the American, like we can learn from their interpretation of our behavior just like they could learn from our interpretation. And then they're going to have to make choices. I mean, if the pressure for economic development is so strong in that period, you know, historically, you know, that the negative consequences for the workers is outweighed by that, then that may be a decision that culture makes. Now, we may disagree, and we may fight because we believe the human rights surrounding those decisions for those workers overpower the economic interests of that country at that given time. But we have to respect that country may make the decision that the economic interest is greater. Now, we can disagree, and we can find ways to respond to that, but it isn't just simply, you know, cut and dry like that. Anyway, I have to run, but thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful time.
Thank you very much. Are you going to visit us in South Asia?
When's spring break? Where were you guys?
Okay, great.
I'll find you.
Okay.
Great, thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Enjoy it. Bye-bye.
So I think it's noon. So I'm not going to, you know, we can end our session. Just one thing, you know, I think next time we'll spend a little bit more on logistical aspects. We didn't spend much time today. But one thing, I'm going to send out a message because I need to know, like, I think the big thing, apart from the passports and the inoculations, which we need to get on with immediately, is I also need to collect money, you know, and I think I'm going to break it down to like 3. like end of October, end of November, mid-December, just giving you a little bit some extra time. And it'll be roughly about 1200, something like that. So I'll send out a message.
When is our next meeting?
Yeah, sure.
When is our next meeting?
Next meeting is next Monday around the same time, but it'll be in PC 205.
Not Thursday.
No. Should we do it on Thursday?
No, I just did it. Everyone has a class on Monday.
What should that happen? Let's see. I mean, it's hard to know. Yeah. Okie dokie. Thanks. Yeah.
Great job. Thank you so much.
No problem.